Okay, in the example in ADO.NET class today, we looked at a simple application that just used some of the ADO objects that we spoke about in the last lecture. So I'll just quickly run through it for you. We created a form, we dragged 3 buttons onto it and a list box, and then we wired up the buttons. So for the first button, the connect button, we created when the button's pressed in the click handler, we create a new SQL connection object. We then set the connection string for that connection object. I showed you a website that helps with connection strings. There's an awful lot of stuff you can specify in it. For us, we have a pretty basic, simple one. We specify the data source as the local host. Most of us only have one instance or have a default instance of SQL Server running, so that works. If you had multiple instances or you wanted to specify an instance, you would specify that as part of your data host string. I then went on to specify the initial catalog is equal to payables. That's the name of the database, the example database with the Muroc textbook. If you haven't installed that, I suggested you could make it one of the sample databases that you're using in your SQL course. So once the connection string is defined, we have a connection object with a connection string. We can just call open on the connection object. We popped up a message box and we saw that indeed the connection was open. We went and looked at the connections in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. We then closed, and we popped up a message box that reported the connection state, and it reports the state to be open. We then close the connection and pop up a message box. Again, the message is just reporting the connection state, and it reports itself to be closed. And that simply showed open and closed. Okay, the next thing we did was the query button, which is button 2. So in the click handler for that, we have the exact same connection string. So we created a connection object. We need a connection object to connect to the database. We set up the same connection string. We're connecting to the same database. We open the connection, and now we create a SQL command object. So we knew up a new SQL command object called command. We set the command text for that SQL command object. Okay, so we have a SQL command object. We set the command text to a string that contains the SQL code that we want to execute. Notice I'm putting a little @ sign in front of all my strings. When you put the @ sign in front of a string literal, it removes any special meaning to characters, like the backslash no longer means quote, so you don't have to write double backslashes if you want a single backslash. Okay, so I set my command text. I also set the SQL command object has a property that's the connection property. So I set that property to be my connection that I created and opened at the couple lines above. And then I instantiate a reader variable. That's a SQL reader. SQL data reader. I'm just using var here, but I guess I should type it out. SQL data reader. So reader is a SQL data reader object, and we spoke about those in last class. And when I run the execute reader member of the command object, of that SQL command object, it returns a reader object. So it executes that select statement and fills the reader object up with the results. So then I have just a little loop here. I check if my reader has any rows. If it doesn't, I don't want to do anything, but if it does, while I still have a row, so reader.read returns a row, I'm going to add something to my list box. And each time I'm going to add, what I do is I use get_string, so it does reader, get_string, and the parameter I'm passing is 1. So that's going to get the column number 1, which is the second column, 0, 1, which in the vendor table happens to be the name of the vendor, so it is a string, and adds that to an item in the list box. Okay, if I wanted a column that had a number, I'd have to use get_SQL decimal or get_SQL integer or one of the appropriate get_SQL methods. Okay, so that's, and then I close the reader when I'm done. And we'll have a look at that. I didn't have that working in class because I had a typo here. I said reader.hasRows. The same as in the if statement. What I needed to do was call reader. Anyways, I'll click on query, and it goes ahead, it connects to the database, and it lists all of it does a select on the vendors, and it lists all of the names. And we can go to SQL Management Studio and run the same query, select star from vendors, and run that query, and you can see there's the same names: U.S. Postal Service, National Information, etc., all the way down to Federal Express Corporation. So we have the same names, and in the same order. There's no order by clause or anything. Okay, and that was our example from class today. And next class we'll look at data sets objects.